Another America. The Story of Liberia and the Former Slaves Who Ruled It. By James Cement. Preface. On the afternoon of April 22, 1980, Gabriel Nimley, the Republic of Liberia's newly installed information minister, summoned 40 or so foreign reporters to the press room of the Executive Mansion, which overlooked the Atlantic from its perch in Monrovia, the Liberian capital. "Gentlemen," he announced, "you are all invited to some executions at Barclay Beach." 10 days before and 7 floors above, soldiers under the command of Nimley's new boss, Master Sergeant Samuel Doe, had burst into the presidential bedroom and gunned down William Tolbert, the last in an unbroken, 133-year line of improbable rulers, freed slaves and free blacks who had fled America, established Black Africa's first republic, and passed it on to their descendants. The reporters raced to the nearby ocean front in taxis. When they arrived, they found hundreds of soldiers and thousands of civilians milling about excitedly, the focus of their attention 9 telephone poles hastily erected atop a gently sloping dune. After a short while, a white Volkswagen bus pulled up. Soldiers pulled 13 men from it, all condemned officials from the previous administration. They included, among others, Richard Henrys, the former Speaker of the House, Joseph Chesson, the much-hated Justice Minister, and Frank Tolbert, President pro tem of the Senate and older brother of the recently murdered president. All had endured 10 days of confinement and humiliation in front of kangaroo court tribunals, and looked the part. They were unshaven and their clothes were torn. Some appeared to have been beaten. The soldiers stripped them to their waists and then grabbed 9 and tied them to the poles with a single long strand of green rope. It took half an hour for the non-commissioned officers in charge to clear the line of fire, as many of the soldiers were drunk and shouting epithets at the men. 2 of the older prisoners passed out. The cloudless sky, so typical of late dry season weather in Monrovia, offered no protection from the equatorial sun. Finally, 9 rifle-wielding soldiers opened fire. Several missed their targets. Other soldiers, armed with machine guns, ran up and poured bullets into the now slumped-over bodies. The dead were untied and left lying at the base of the poles as the 4 remaining prisoners were lined up. This time, there was no pretense of order. When the shooting stopped, there was a brief silence and then cheering, first from the soldiers and then from the crowd. As one enlisted man told a reporter, "The men had no right to live after all those years killing our people and stealing our money." It was a rage generations in the making. Like many American high school students, I first learned of Liberia in passing, a brief aside from the heroic story of abolitionism and the headlong rush to civil war. That tiny colorless patch surrounded by British pink and French blue on colonial maps of Africa intrigued me. What happened to those freed slaves who had gone back to Africa? An answer of sorts came from the photos of the 1980 executions that appeared on the front pages of newspapers across the world. I began to think of Liberia as a noble experiment that had ended awfully. Freed slaves, given the chance to govern themselves, had turned out to be no better than the white imperialists who had descended upon Africa around the same time. If there was any lesson to be taken from Liberian history, it was a general one about human nature. An oppressed people could readily become oppressors. Events after 1980, especially the Civil War that began on Christmas Eve, 1989, it would prove to be one of the most brutal in post-colonial Africa's blood-stained history, shocking the world with images of drugged child soldiers, costumed as if for Halloween, AK-47s hanging loosely from their skinny brown shoulders, led to a new round of questions. What could possibly have led to this? What role did that century and a half of America-Liberian rule play in the terror that followed? And, again, what had happened to the descendants of the former American slaves who founded the nation? When a temporary peace came in the late 1990s, I traveled to Liberia to find out. It was not easy to get to then, not even from Abidjan, the commercial capital of neighboring Ivory Coast. There were no regular flights to Liberia, the country's international airport had been destroyed, but there was an expat Ukrainian operation running Soviet-era turboprops into the country. From the air, I saw that Liberia began where the roads ended. For the next 200 miles, there was nothing but endless forest and the occasional village of conical roofed huts. Liberia appeared unchanged from Graham Greene's descriptions of the country 60 years earlier, in his travelogue Journey Without Maps. On the ground, however, recent history was all too evident. Monrovia was in ruins, having been the objective, in 1996, of the last great offensive of the Civil War, a battle residents referred to with the shorthand April 6. Few buildings had windows, many bore the distinctive gaping holes that rocket-propelled grenades left behind. Still, there were people everywhere, along the streets, in the rubble, on the beaches. When Doe took power in 1980, Monrovia was home to 100,000 residents. Now it had 1 million, mostly refugees from the war-torn countryside. My residence was a large, well-appointed house on the heights of Mamba Point, once Monrovia's ritziest oceanfront address. With its manicured tropical gardens and solid Mediterranean furniture, the house could have been in Florida. It appeared untouched by the war. And, indeed, it hadn't been. Its owner, a scion of one of the wealthiest and most powerful Americo-Liberian families, had been the country's sports minister before the war and had recruited a score of burly soccer players to stand guard on his property. Getting into town every day proved difficult. Monrovia's fleet of taxis, many in no better shape than its buildings, did not cruise the district where I was staying. So each morning, before the sun got too hot, I would climb the small hill that separated Mamba Point from downtown. Above and to my left stood the Ducor Hotel, where the Americo elite had once danced through the night at weddings and debutante balls. To the right loomed the Grey Stone, fortress-like Masonic temple, the largest in Africa, where Americo politicians met in conclaves to decide the fate of the nation they still ran. Both buildings were derelict now, each occupied by hundreds of refugees. During my trips into Monrovia proper and upcountry, when I would hitch a ride with 8 workers, I interviewed everyone I could: politicians, military men, church leaders, journalists, human rights activists, businessmen, ex-child soldiers, ordinary citizens. These were Americos, many of whom still occupied high places in Liberian society, natives, and people of mixed heritage. Almost to a person, I was greeted warmly. Having never been the subjects of Western imperialists, Liberians evince little animus toward white people. They also genuinely like Americans. In the interviews, I sensed that many felt we were practically kin, though the sentiment always seemed tinged with disappointment. As one refugee recalled wondering as he watched helicopters rescue American personnel from the embassy during April 6, "We think America is a big brother. What do they think of us now? They all want us to die here?" I tried to examine the nation's archives, but they had been destroyed in the fighting. Fortunately, I found when I returned home that substantial records had been preserved in this country: Liberian and foreign newspapers, official and personal papers, travel accounts, memoirs, and thousands of letters the Americo settlers wrote home to their families and their former masters. First impressions confirmed suspicions. The Americo-Liberian ruling class had been corrupt, callow, and callous, at one time even being accused by an international tribunal of running a slave ring. But as I progressed through the literature, the story acquired nuance and specificity. The kinship contemporary Liberians of all backgrounds felt with Americans had deeper and more meaningful roots than I, and perhaps even my interviewees, had ever imagined. The early settlers of Liberia brought the mores of their homeland with them. They arrived in West Africa full of entrepreneurial energy but also with a propensity to settle disputes with violence. Their benevolence was inseparable from their firm conviction that theirs was a superior civilization. In Africa, they endeavored to recreate the only social and political order they knew, that of the antebellum South, with themselves as the master class. They erected buildings in the style of plantation mansions and dressed in formal 19th-century clothes, despite the equatorial climate. They adopted the symbols of home, evident in the red, white and blue Lone Star flag and the Liberian dollar. They established familiar institutions, one-room schoolhouses, fraternal organizations, and evangelical churches. A few of the more well-to-do settlers carved plantations out of the jungle and, from columned porches, sent orders to the natives tilling their cotton, tobacco, and coffee crops. The Americos by and large equated liberty with the pursuit of money, and venerated the merchants among them who made small fortunes trading with Westerners. Most telling, they established a republic but kept it for themselves. The Liberian Declaration of Independence began, "We, the people of the Republic of Liberia, were originally the inhabitants of the United States of North America." The Liberian Constitution largely ignored the natives, except as objects of paternalist protection, much like the slaves the Americos had once been, at least in the minds of the planters who owned them. But Liberia occupies a mere slice of land, and the Americo population never topped 20,000. Just as the history of the United States is inseparable from the vastness of the North American continent, the history of Liberia is inseparable from its geographic and demographic smallness. The Americos, especially the Monrovia elite, intermarried so often that a few generations into their history many of them were related in one way or another. As in America, the elite had a dynastic quality: politicians begat politicians, and the right last name could mean everything. But in Liberia the circle was a fraction of the size. The Americos' history can be seen as a family saga, spanning generations and rife with profligate sons and malcontent daughters, strivers and schemers, scandal and achievement. It has the feel, the richness, of a novel. Viewing the Americos in this light leads one to see tragedy, not justice, in their violent demise at the hands of a people they by and large oppressed. Hidebound by their Americanness and surrounded and outnumbered by natives, they could never reconcile their idealism with their pursuit of power and wealth, and with their very survival. This book is about how the tension between idealism and survival defined a nation. The freed slaves and free blacks who first colonized the Windward Coast, and the whites who sent them, disagreed on many things, including who should run the colony. They did agree that, if nothing else, Liberia should be a black man's place. They meant different things by this, of course. Liberia was born of a white idea, that the burgeoning and unwanted population of free blacks and emancipated slaves in post-revolutionary America could be sent to Africa. The early 19th century politicians who devised this idea considered it an inspired one. America could rid itself of its most useless and pernicious class of people while simultaneously establishing a beachhead from which Africa could be civilized and Christianized. The settlers who eventually signed up to be a part of the experiment, meanwhile, dreamed only of a free haven for all persons of African descent. But their idealism was hard to sustain on the Windward Coast. To the natives, the settlers, though they looked uncannily like themselves, were just another group of outsiders with hostile intentions. They called the newcomers the black white men and attacked their settlements. As one early settler explained in a letter to his former master in America, "You can try to help the natives but they still will be your enemy." This was not entirely fair. The settlers did plenty of their own provoking. But the remark was revealing, as it was a sign that the erosion of the settlers' idealism started almost concurrently with the experiment itself. The settlers, and later the Americos, could never really decide whether the Africans were their long-lost brethren, heathens to be redeemed, or savages to be conquered. And in almost every instance, they put their survival over their ideals. Not that every Liberian was determined to keep the native in his place, beyond the frontier or laboring for a pittance in settler households and on settler farms. Edward Blyden, Liberia's greatest intellectual and one of the progenitors of black nationalism, condemned his countrymen for their reluctance to truly integrate with the natives. He thought that the Americos were uniquely positioned to create a new kind of civilization, part African communalist traditions and part progressive Western thought. He even got one of his allies, Edmund Roy, elected president in 1870, though this had less to do with African solidarity than it did with the resentment the dark-skinned majority of poor Americos, many of them fresh from slavery, had for the mulatto elite. The ideal of Liberia as a haven for blacks endured after Blyden's time, though the welcome was now a more conditional one. Liberia did everything it could to lure new immigrants from America, offering them farm lots or town plots, immediate citizenship, and racial supremacy. Nobody except persons of African descent could be citizens, the Constitution declared. But in the 1920s, when Marcus Garvey promised to send tens of thousands of American blacks to Liberia in the largest Back to Africa effort in history, the Liberian elite demurred, worried that his provocative anti-colonialist rhetoric would hurt its relations with the West. This kind of survival had its perks. The Americos, strengthening their ties to the West in the aftermath of World War II, began to prosper. Tire and steel manufacturers across the world came to Liberia for its rubber and iron ore, making possible the rise of an American middle class. Many Liberians saw their influence and wealth peak in the 1950s and 1960s. This was the era of those fancy dress balls at the Ducor Hotel, of Americos going on shopping trips to the White Rose supermarket in their American sedans, and of vacations in Europe. But even as they thrived, their world was coming undone. The liberation of much of the rest of the continent from European rule turned Liberia, with its slavishly American culture and pro-Western foreign policy, into an anachronism. At home, concubinage, intermarriage, and the ward system, through which Americo families adopted native children, inculcating them with civilization and Christianity, were slowly blurring the line between the Americos and the more educated classes of natives. Many of the radical leaders whose ideas inspired Doe in the spring of 1980 were the half-breed products of these institutions. There was a profound irony to all of this. 133 years of putting survival ahead of idealism, a tenable strategy for its time, was what ultimately led to the demise of Americo-Liberian rule and the Americo-Liberian way of life. Anxious that the African masses would overwhelm them politically, they gave them little say in the Republic. Fearing the idea of going native, they clung to their Western culture and forced the Africans they admitted into their ranks to give up theirs. Finally, the very people the Americos had done so much to co-opt or keep down had had enough and rose up against them. For the Americos, Being in Africa but not of it proved an impossible proposition in the end. Yet if irony pervades Liberian history, so do hope and courage. They have from the very beginning, when the first settlers left this country with dreams of a better one, in a land that, despite their ancestry, they knew almost nothing about.